Welcome to Bench to Bedside, a weekly series of live conversations about recent advances in cancer, from the research bench to treatment at the patient's bedside. And now, your host and the director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center, Dr. Roy Jensen.
Virtually all cancers have the potential to spread or metastasize to other parts of the body. Once this happens, cancer becomes much more difficult to treat. In fact, nearly all cancer deaths are a result of metastasis, making it vitally important for researchers to better understand how and why cancer spreads. Hi, I'm Dr. Roy Jensen, director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center, and with me this morning is Dr. Danny Welch, who has dedicated his 40-year career to better understanding cancer metastasis. So welcome, Dr. Welch.
Thank you.
What does it mean when we use the phrase cancer metastasis?
You said it in your introduction. It's the spread of cancer to other parts of the body, and those tumor cells that move to other parts of the body actually begin to grow like a colony that originated from the original tumor. It's also called stage 4, and so those two terms are used interchangeably.
I see. So are certain people or certain cancers make a patient more likely to have a greater risk for cancer spreading?
Well, virtually all cancers have the ability to spread, but not all cancers do so with equal efficiency. One of the most common cancers in humans, as you know, is a skin cancer called basal cell carcinoma. It invades a lot but doesn't metastasize. But there are other tumor types like melanoma, which is also a skin cancer, that metastasizes very widely and to different parts of the body. Melanomas that spread to other parts of the skin, that's bad, but it's not as deadly as the melanomas that spread to the brain or vital organs. And then I think another part of your question, as I understood it, is that are there patients who are more susceptible to developing metastasis and others are resistant? And there's emerging data from the last decade or so that have been experiments that have been done in mice, but they're being now extrapolated or translated into the human population, that certain strains of mouse develop metastases much more frequently, and other strains are very resistant. And part of the research that we're doing is to try and figure out what is it that makes certain patients resistant. If we can exploit that, maybe we can help patients.
So you and I have seen a lot of breakthroughs over the last few decades in cancer research. And one thing that hasn't really happened to any significant extent is progress being made in the prevention and treatment of metastatic cancers.
Right.
Could you tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are on that?
Well, I don't disagree with you. Not as much progress has been made in the area of metastasis, but I do think there has been progress. When I first started working in a laboratory, the prediction was that no patient with stage 4 breast cancer would survive 5 years. We're now approaching somewhere in the 40 to 50% of women with stage 4 breast cancer can live 5 years or longer. So there has been progress, but it's been eking along at a much slower pace. I think part of what we're trying to talk about is why the pace has been a little bit slower.
Right.
Sadly, a lot of people don't do metastasis research, in part because it's hard and it's so complex. Cancer's complex, everybody understands that. Now multiply that by 10 and you start to talk about the process of metastasis.
Right.
We still have a modicum of understanding of what causes cancer in the first place. Metastasis is the black box inside of that box that is what causes cancer. And now that there's a firmer foothold on what causes cancer, too much ultraviolet light, oxidants, things that cause mutations in DNA that cause cancer. Now we can start understanding what happens at that basal level and adding on top of that what causes metastasis. Does that make sense?
So, yes. So one would think that if cancer is causing, or cancer metastases are causing the vast majority of cancer deaths, that's where the majority of cancer research funding would be. Could you comment a little bit about whether or not that's true or not?
That's a hard question to answer. I just got an email yesterday from someone who was comparing the federal budget for the National Cancer Institute, and I'm going to use round numbers. $5 billion is the NCI budget on average. 400 million are the grants that mention the word metastasis. So that's 7.5% of the budget. It was not that long ago that only 8% of grants even used the word metastasis. And that's how this number was calculated. So it hasn't changed at least in 10 years. But even the mention of the word metastasis doesn't necessarily mean the research is about metastasis. All it has to do is have that word in it, or something happened. So it's a myth in a way that metastasis is the focus, although it is what causes the 90+% of side effects or deaths.
So if you're just joining us, we're here with Dr. Danny Welch talking about cancer metastasis. And Megan Peters is here in the studio to take your questions. And remember to share this link with people you think might benefit from our discussion. Use the hashtag #BenchToBedside. So over the course of your career, you've made some really extraordinary discoveries that have helped build our understanding of how cancer spreads. Could you tell us about some of those?
Well, it's a little like selling myself, but I'm really proud. I think, first of all, I've been blessed to be working with a lot of brilliant students and postdocs and that type of thing. And it's a team effort. So a couple of things that besides those trainees, one of the things my lab is most recognized for are discovery of a large number of metastasis suppressor genes and the proteins they encode. Those are molecules that are like the brakes in a car. They control the cells moving forward or spreading to other places, and they're lost in metastatic cancers. And we've identified 8 of them. The most recent one is in pancreatic cancer, where we've been able to slow metastasis by about 90%. And that's a disease where the 5-year survival is only around 2%, mostly due to metastasis. So we're very excited about that. And most recently, we've been studying another set of genes in the body. In every cell, what most people are surprised to learn, and I had to relearn, so I don't want to insult anybody by this. When they did the Human Genome Project, it measured all the genes in the nucleus of a cell. But every cell has another genome, and that's in an organelle known as the mitochondrion, or what we often are taught in grade school and high school is the powerhouse of the cell. It takes nutrients and converts them into energy. Well, the genome in the mitochondrion is very small, and it has some unusual characteristics. You only inherit it from your mother, and the sequencing of that genome helps define human races because of differences that are inherited. So there's a common mother known as mitochondrial Eve, but as humans migrated to Europe and Asia and then the Americas, the energy, the food one consumed had to be converted into different kinds of energy. If you have to run the savannah to catch something for dinner, that's a very different need than being in Scandinavia where it's cold and you want some of that energy converted to heat so you don't freeze to death. So mitochondria define different races. And we've been using that information to look at how mitochondria might control metastasis. And this month, we have had two new discoveries from the lab that it's not just the mitochondria in the tumor cells that are important, it's the mitochondria in the supporting cells. So the blood vessels, the immune system, and even the microbiome. Those are all those little bacteria that exist in our gut. The mitochondria in our cells regulate those bacteria. And so we're thinking that crosstalk is what's going to be really critical. So those are just a couple of the things that we've been part of.
So, one of the reasons why we invited you on the show this morning is last year you published, in my mind, an extraordinarily important review article that helped to identify and list the key characteristics of metastases. Could you tell us a little bit about that list of those characteristics and why they're so significant?
Well, if you'll allow me, I'm going to start with why I think it's significant first. I started my career after finishing graduate school in the pharmaceutical industry. And one of the things that I think it's important for people on this broadcast to understand is that to develop drugs or develop therapies, you have to have a target. And identifying the right target is the critical distinction between a therapy that will be successful versus just something you're giving people, a placebo. And early on in the pharma industry, I was asked and proposed that we identify what the most important targets were. And the first company I worked for, we invited 100 people from around the world. We spent 4 days cloistered, no phones, and anything else to communicate with the outside world. And we identified what we thought were the right targets. That was in 1984. We were wrong. We'll start out with that. And we and others tried clinical trials on those targets, and they didn't really work. So this paper was a re-looking at what are the appropriate targets, taking into account the data that's accumulated in addition since the mid-1980s and looking for what those targets are. So my colleague Doug Hurst and I reviewed the literature, reviewed something in the neighborhood of 40,000 papers that have been published, which tells you that I read a lot more things besides wonderful novels at night. But the 4 things that we saw that were hallmarks of metastasis, that are things that exist in every metastatic cell. The first is their ability to crawl around or be motile and invade. I think that was early on quite well recognized. In fact, that was still our #1 target in 1984. But drugs that have prevented motility and invasion have not worked especially well because crawling around and invading occurs often before the tumor's diagnosed. But even after the metastases develop, they can still be invade, and so it's still a legitimate target to prevent metastases from metastasizing again.
Mm-hmm.
The second hallmark is the ability to communicate with other parts of the body, and they manipulate the other parts of the body. I think it's phenomenal to think that one of the earliest steps is that the cancer cells communicate with the bone marrow to cause migration of bone marrow cells that set up, I call them, an analogy as a vacation home for the cancer cells.
Mm-hmm.
They go to the lungs and they manipulate that environment and make it more hospitable for the tumor cell. They manipulate the immune system so that the immune system is helping tumors spread versus inhibiting them. New immunotherapies are beginning to harness how that communication with the immune system is taking place. It's working incredibly well. Melanoma, certain kidney cancers, and the like, it works really well. Other cancer types like breast cancers, a little bit more cold.
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding that communication, I think, is critical. The third hallmark, so they invade, they're motile, they communicate. The third one is that they are adaptable. If you think about moving from the breast to the brain, they're crawling around locally, they get into the bloodstream, they go through the heart, they end up somewhere else. And the entire time they're being attacked. And they have to shapeshift, they have to change what they're expressing so that they're not going to be as recognized by the immune system, even if they haven't manipulated a certain population. Mm-hmm. So the ability to adapt is critical. I think one of the best analogies that I've been able to come up with so far is if you visit a foreign country, you have to be adaptable to what's happening there, but you're still you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have to adapt. And then the final hallmark is after the cells have done all of those things, they get somewhere else. They have to grow and they have to colonize another tissue. Back in my past, I used to play a lot of tennis, and if I walked onto the center court at Wimbledon, so what? I'm just there. I have to win the tournament.
Not for long, because the police would probably chase you off.
That's true, and they probably would have. But I would have to beat Rafa or Roger Federer to actually be a successful tennis player. Mm-hmm. A tumor cell that gets into the bloodstream's got to do more than just get there. It's got to grow. Mm-hmm. And that is the one step that I think consensus is targetable right now for a new class of drugs to prevent that colonization. And if we could do that, I think would change the way metastasis is treated and prevented.
So how do you conceive of the concept of tumor metastasis and cancer stem cell? How do those jive?
There's a lot of similarities. Stem cells are those cells in our body that generate other populations. Mm-hmm. And the original theory actually dates back to the 1950s. So before I was born, I think even before you were born.
Even.
Yes. Sorry, I had to say it. But most of those thoughts are how similar cancers are to a developing embryo. When I'm teaching graduate students or medical students, I ask them to close their eyes and think of what they look like when they started as a fertilized egg. They were round and shapeless. But now, if they open their eyes and look in a mirror, they've got hair and skin and eyes and lips and all of that. Cancer cells start from one round, shapeless cell, but they develop all these other things. That is the ultimate definition of a stem cell. And those data add to it, and some of the cells that the stem cell makes are able to move and colonize. So there's a lot of relationships, but they're not perfect. The theory doesn't fit everywhere, like any analogy.
Right, yeah. So what do you think the future of treatment is going to be for metastatic cancers, and kind of where would you like to see the field move?
Well, I think the trajectory is in the right direction. Survival is getting longer. Quality of life is getting better. Not great, but it's getting better. I think the future holds if we can learn how to target the colonization step, the potential for rendering cancer a chronic, controllable disease like diabetes. We don't cure diabetes now, we control it.
Right.
No one wants to keep a cancer cell in their body. I don't either.
Right.
But absent being able to eliminate all of them, if we can keep them under control and give people a normal lifespan, whatever they would live to otherwise, and retain quality of life, that to me would be a huge success.
Right. So on that topic, you've been involved with a number of organizations that have specifically advocated for patients with metastatic cancer. Could you tell us a little bit about that work that you've done?
I think one of the most transforming aspects of my career was when at the American Association for Cancer Research, I was invited just to come into a room where they were trying an experiment and that experiment's called the Scientist Survivor Program. And it pairs patient advocates with a scientist who's attending this meeting that's 20,000 people. Even as a scientist, you and I both go to this meeting every year. It's intimidating. There are 6,000 posters, 20,000 plus people presenting stuff from every aspect of cancer. And even though we're in it every day, I know I don't understand a good chunk of it. For a patient or somebody who's trying to educate patients, it's highly intimidating. And I got to spend time with these wonderful folks who were highly educated, but they were asking very fundamental questions, and my job was to try and facilitate. And through that, I got introduced to a lot of great women who were with Komen, Medivivor, the American Cancer Society. There are a bunch of different groups. And they would ask me what researchers are doing, like we're doing today, and I was able to ask them what they need as patients. And trying to align those two views of the same thing to drive my lab's research and advise funding organizations and that type of thing, to focus on what's important. Lately, there are a couple of big issues. Patients have told me and others, I don't just want quantity of life, I want quality with it. Living another year but being miserable all the time, that's not helpful. So that helps us do things, and pioneering it here at KU's Cancer Center. Survivorship clinics, other places are doing it too. How do we meet those needs of the metastatic patient? And how do we do research that fills that quality of life as much as the quantity?
So we're coming to the close of today's episode. What would you say are some of the key takeaways for our audience?
There has been progress. I think that's the number one thing. There's a lot of hope on the horizon. It's not easy. I started this out saying in 1984, the 100 top people in the world, we were wrong. But we've learned more, we've refined it, and we're doing that even today. I hope we're not wrong with anything that I've said today. I think we're right, but they'll still be refined. There's been a major transformation. It started before I started studying cancer. Back in prior to Betty Ford acknowledging that she had breast cancer, you didn't mention the word cancer in polite conversation. It was the C word. In early 2000s, getting metastatic disease, you didn't mention it in polite conversation. It was the M word. People would be marginalized. They'd lose insurance, the financial toxicities. Friends would stop talking to a metastatic patient thinking, you're going to die. And that is no longer the case. We've taken metastasis by doing things like today, just educating folks. We can take some of those stigmas away, and we'll move towards the quality of life, and by removing those stigmas, the quality of life as well.
Well, I think that's a great summary, and Dr. Welch, I want to thank you for being part of this week's episode of Bench to Bedside. That's it for today. To learn more about Dr. Welch's Hallmarks of Metastasis literature review, visit kucancercenter.org/metastasis. Join us next week at 10 a.m. for Bench to Bedside. Thanks for watching.